Hey everybody, this is Anna. Welcome back to Painting Big. Today we are on to our new series, Concepts in Mini Painting. This is kind of a catch-all for a lot of the kind of intro elementary stuff that I couldn't cover in fundamentals. Like fundamentals are really technique based, if you know what I mean, for the most part, supplies and techniques. Now we're going to start talking a little bit more about different kinds of paint lines and color theory and maybe some conceptual techniques like non-metallic metals and stuff like that. It's kind of a catch-all for all that stuff that's a little bit more like concepts, the way you think about a thing. So we're going to open this with paint, which is one of my favorite subjects. For those of you who know, I am the person who invented the Reaper Master Series paint line. I was hired by Reaper in 2003, and I spent pretty much the first 6 months of my job experimenting with different bases and different combinations of pigment, learning how to mix paint under the tutelage of a couple of the Reaper owners. And then they kind of pushed me off on my own and went, okay, go. So I spent many of the next several years learning paint chemistry, just enough to get by pretty much, so I could actually talk to my suppliers like an educated person and learn what made paints work, why they work. So that's kind of what makes my Patreon and this channel a little bit different, is I'm coming at it from a little bit of a different angle on the education side. All right? So without further ado, let's jump into paint. So this is not going to be a survey of every paint line out there. Not only do I not own them all, but they come and go so quickly that it would be hard to keep this video updated if I tried to do that. So instead, what I want to kind of talk about is different types of paint lines. And I will give some examples on all of these. Most of them I own and have directly interacted with. And I'll talk a little bit about kind of the mindset going into some of this stuff. Like, if you get into Games Workshop, how is that different than if you start with Chimera color? So believe it or not, you really can classify paint lines into kind of different, I would say different types, because every paint line designer, every company has a different goal entering into designing a paint line. Now, for some people, like maybe Privateer Press or Paizo, who contracted with Reaper to do their Pathfinder paint line, that goal is to put out a set of colors, right, that emulate the colors that they imagine being the key ones for their armies in their world, for their characters, stuff like that, right? That's definitely a goal of some companies who create paint lines. But when you're talking about an actual paint company, which is most gaming companies hire a paint company to create their stuff, right? So for the most part, those paint companies are going to be going into a line. They're going to be going, okay, what do you want? And maybe the gaming company goes, oh, I want coverage, because I want people to be able to just slap the color on and then get that model out on the table and game with it. Something like that, right? Or maybe it's a company like Games Workshop who's contracting out and they're like, all right, so this is how we're going to do it. We want a bunch of different types of paints so that people will always be able to reach for something to solve the problem they've got, right? Whatever they want to do with the model, we want to be able to hand them that solution. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. I'm going to show you some examples. Let's get to it. All right, so I just talked about Games Workshop. Let's talk about Multitasker Lines. This is what I call them. And these are the lines that are the ones where I want to say they're going to hand you the fish. They're not going to teach you how to fish. They are going to hand you the exact fish you need for every task you've got. I class Army Painter also because for a lot of their things, they're very much emulating a lot of what Games Workshop's doing, right? And these kind of lines, they really will. They'll have a line for regular painting or base coating, right? They'll have washes. They'll have, contrast paints or the equivalent, right? These are made to be used over white primer or Zenith to get a very quick highlight mid-tone shade effect so that you can just, again, throw one coat on and be on the table. And if that's what you're looking for, then these lines are great for that. I mean, obviously Games Workshop coming into the industry with decades of experience in this sort of thing. They've really fine-tuned what they want in a paint line at this point, and they're always iterating. Like the contrast line was a new product, several years ago. Nobody else had anything like it. Now everybody's trying to duplicate it. Now the downside of these multitask lines, well, there's two. One is budget. These lines are going to cost you quite a bit of money. Whether they're priced up like Games Workshop or not quite priced as much like Army Painter, you're still buying a lot of different paints to get where you want to be. Like, in order to do everything, because you're not necessarily learning how to mix your own everything, you end up picking up a lot of paint. Because you need every tool in the toolbox so that you have exactly what you need when you reach for it. So you differentiate that from a line like Reaper or even Vallejo, where although they have some functionality, like almost every paint line these days has some washes or has a primer or sealer, you know, they tend to have that stuff. But mostly they're just giving you a selection of colors that then you can do whatever you like with, right? Let's talk about the coverage lines first, and then we'll talk about MSP, because MSP is its own beast. So go away, Games Workshop, and let's bring in Vallejo. Vallejo is really like kind of the key coverage line. I feel like when they entered the scene, a lot of things changed. They were the first real dropper bottle line, for one thing. But another thing was that they had a lot of coverage. So their paints came out very high coverage, and nobody had really seen anything like that before, and we all really, you know, enjoyed it. Some of it anyway. So when a paint line goes for coverage, there's things that they get really good at. Obviously, base coating is going to be a dream because you're going to have really good coverage, better than any other line most of the time. You're also going to be able to wet blend really easily. A lot of them have kind of a silky or plasticky texture that's very smooth. They tend to be a little thicker, which helps with coverage also. So when you're wet on wet blending, that can make this a lot easier. Things that they don't do as well. There is an actual chemical factor in here, a chemistry factor, where when you are using a resin, and by resins I mean, you know, like latex acrylic. You all have heard of latex house paint, acrylic house paint. Nowadays those polymers are actually not real latex, and they're all like synthetics that they've created in the lab. But that's the resin particle. And what the resin particle governs is coverage, partially. Pigment does the rest, and adhesion. So when you get a really high coverage particle resin, it tends to be kind of fragile. It tends to be more plasticky, softer, and if you thin it a lot, it tends to rub off easier. The other thing that's really hard is because it's made for coverage, if you need it to do something that requires transparency, like a wash or a glaze, you have to thin the bejeebus out of it to get it to go that way. So you have to work harder to get that result. So that's the downside of going with a high coverage line, is that when you do need to create a wash or create a glaze or do something like layering where you're trying to be more smooth and not as textured, they can fight you on that. And you'll end up spending a lot of time mixing a lot of water into that paint. And that's where I was actually when I was using paints like this. And it's actually influenced why I began to create Master Series. Now, before we talk about MSP, I want to talk a bit about Pro-Acryl. I originally classed Pro-Acryl. I think I did the PDF for this actually for my $2 tier before I actually finished this video because I wanted my new face cam. But I classed them as coverage, but to be very fair to Pro-Acryl, they're not always, they're kind of halfway, I think, between a coverage line and MSP. When they can make the call for coverage, like putting out a Pyrrole Red, which is a particular red pigment that nobody else actually puts out, which is why I own this paint. This is a very high coverage red. But not all of their colors are tuned expressly to be the highest coverage. So I would call them somewhere between a high coverage line and a versatility line. MSP, Reaper MSP, Master Series paint, the paint line that I created, is a versatility line. I went this way because there were things about other lines of paint at the time that really irritated me. I didn't like that they didn't stick to the model. I didn't like that they didn't have adhesion. I thin my paint a lot, and if you don't have a lot of really fine resins in your paint, it will make the paint fragile. So I was really annoyed that it didn't stick very well, that it rubbed off. Some of the high coverage lines even rub off even with a thick color. And I wanted something that was easier to thin. Like, I hated having to stop and add so much water to my paint to get it to the point where, at that point, when I was doing this and when I was first winning awards, smooth blends were all the rage. And you needed your paint to be at a specific consistency for that. And I had to fight with those high coverage lines, just infinite amounts of water. And then they would tend to separate because they really weren't made to do that. And that's another chemical thing that's related to the resin particle size. I didn't know that at the time, but I knew what I wanted. And so I tested a bunch of paints, and what I ended up with is MSP. The coverage of any given MSP paint is mostly dependent upon the pigment. I used a moderate weight base for most of MSP, so it does not have the intrinsically high coverage nor the thickness of many high coverage lines. Instead, it's more fluid out of the bottle. In general, you have to add so little water to get MSP where you need it, whether you're doing a base coat or you're doing glazing or you're doing layering. Like it wants to go there. It wants to go there with you. So this is a line that instead of coverage is created with the idea that transparency is not a problem, it's a tool. Now we do have higher coverage paints. It's why we created the Bones paint line. Ed, our old CEO, specifically wanted me to make a line that was more geared toward that kind of idea to paint our Bones models with. So if you go to the Bones line and you try out those oranges and yellows, you're going to see that they have superior coverage when you compare them to the old MSP core line, which is what this paint is from, Core Colors. But in general, MSP is made with the philosophy that we want to teach you to fish. We want to give you a paint that's able to do anything that you want to make it do with the minimum of frustration. And that's kind of my philosophy even when I'm shooting these videos. I'm shooting these to kind of save you guys from frustration because I want you guys to love the hobby. So no matter what paint line you choose, and it doesn't have to be mine might not be the right choice for you depending on what you're doing. I want you to understand like the differences so that you can make an educated decision. So let's not babble on anymore about MSP. I've had my say pretty much. Let's go to some more interesting stuff, which is what I will call, let's go to the artist fluid acrylic section of the world. So let's talk about chimera colors and lines like Golden So Flat. So Chimera took the industry by storm several, years and years ago now, by being the first paint company to really focus entirely on pure pigment paints. And what I mean by that is each of these paints, at least up to a certain point, is made with a single pigment. And they tell you which one it is, they tell you whether it's a transparent or not. And there are pigments, including this one, which I think is a cobalt teal, don't quote me on that, but this one is a unique pigment that nobody else uses. So you can get some very unique pigments from this line that are just going to act differently than other ones that you've used. After that happened, a lot of other colors, Reaper actually already had some of this. If you look at our clears, those are also pure pigment colors. Those are our equivalent. However, other lines set out at that point to kind of jump on this bandwagon, right? So for a while there were a lot of lines coming out with kind of like a set of pure pigment colors or of single pigment colors, whatever you want to call them. And then, I'm not sure what actually brought this about, but the art companies, the actual like artist companies, like tube paint artist companies, suddenly realized there was a market for this. The Golden line, actually, I only heard about the So Flat line about a year ago because I was watching Luca on Miniatures Den and he mentioned it. And so I picked up the raw umber because it's a color I really enjoy, and it's a good paint. It's a good paint. It's very, very matte. You can see that even, you don't see a sheen on it as I move. See that sheen on the bottle? You see nothing there? I haven't talked about finishes on paint lines in this one, but maybe we will at some point. So it's a nice flat paint, and you usually want a more matte paint. It doesn't have to be dead matte, but you want something more matte when you're doing miniatures because you want to be able to see the details. So this is good. They put out a ton of different colors. Downsides to these, they tend to be pricey. And the reason they tend to be pricey is because you're dealing with a really highly pigmented paint, and pigment is expensive. So a lot of the cost of a paint is in its pigment, and when you load it up to its threshold so that it's as highly pigmented as possible, which a very high quality artist line will do, that's when you get very pricey paint. Now, the upside of this, though, is with these, you don't need a lot of colors. You don't need a lot of colors because you're able to mix. Which brings us to another caveat. You need to learn to mix. Because you're not being handed 300 colors, you won't have a color for everything. You won't be able to just grab a mid-tone shadow highlight necessarily. So you have to learn that sometimes you have to add a little white for coverage, and the colors are going to vary with transparency, right? We just saw that this was a transparent. It's there in that tiny little print underneath the pigment. So that means this paint is a beautiful color, but it's not going to have a lot of coverage. If you want to use it in a coverage application, you're going to need to add probably a touch of white or some other pigment that is higher coverage. So you have to learn stuff like that to work effectively with fluid acrylics, but it does save you a lot of money. And this is actually my husband, my now husband, when he was a college student and he had just started mini painting, this is the tact he took. He chose colors that were very mixable, and he had a small set of them. And that saved him a lot of money while he was painting miniatures in college. He bought like, what, 10 or 20 paints, and he just learned to mix. So, although it takes time, it's not terribly scary, and you can have some fun experimenting with it. And there are a lot of books that will teach you how to do it. And we'll talk more about color mixing in a later video. This also applies to tube paint. Yes, there is a tube paint line out there for miniatures. Scale 75 does it. They also produce a regular, what I would call a coverage line. They're very, very similar in a lot of ways. The regular miniatures paint line is similar in a lot of ways to Vallejo, I find. But their artist line, this is a line that I actually use. Actually, if I had to choose 2 lines that I use in addition to Master Series all the time, these guys are it. Because I come from an art background, and so I do like to mix, and I understand mixing after 17 years of creating Master Series. You know I know how to mix. So the tube paint line, this was funny. When it came out, when they kickstarted this, my boss thought they were crazy. Like, he and a lot of other people in the industry are like, tube paints for miniatures? Who's gonna care, right? They stopped scoffing when the Kickstarter hit almost $500,000. And I was part of those people that was helping to fund this. But I really love these colors. Even though they are tube paint, they are made to be a little bit more fluid than your standard. You can see how kind of that comes out in a soft peak. So they are a little bit more fluid than your standard tube. They're not as stiff. They're really nicely pigmented, and there are some colors that you can't really find elsewhere also in the Scale Color Artist line. So that's one reason that I really like these. So tube paints have been popular because of their high pigmentation with miniatures artists before. The downside is you have to thin them, and just like with the fluid acrylics, you have to learn to mix, right? So mix, and then you have to learn how much to thin them to get them to do what you want them to do. Sometimes I find that they are more difficult. You do have to add more water. It's something I don't like. I like to mix them every once in a while with Master Series just to get a slightly different color or feel. But yeah, so there you go. That's also, they're out there. The tube paint lines, they are out there. So airbrush lines, like Vallejo Model Air. These are a thing. Some companies, like Badger, put out their paint line is airbrush colors. That's what it is. But many paint companies, like Vallejo, that normally do a separate series of hobby paints, may also have an air line. I think AK also has an air line. And these are just, just call them thinned paints is oversimplifying. It's true. You are paying list price for a paint that's been thinned. However, usually it's been thinned with some, it's not just adding water to it, right? They have to add medium of some sort to keep it in suspension. So you are paying for, a product that has been fine-tuned to go through your airbrush with little or no thinning or doctoring at all. You use it straight in, it should work. So that's the upside. It's very simple. Downside is limited number of colors, unless you are willing to mix. They are pricey. You're buying a whole nother line of paint for your airbrush. Also, you're not learning how to thin your own paint for airbrush for yourself. A lot of lines like Master Series and I think Pro Acryl also goes decent through an airbrush. But many of these paint lines, if you learn to thin them to the right amount, they go really well through an airbrush. So that gives you more versatility, right? Suddenly you have all the colors from these lines and you're able to create an airbrush color with any of them instead of sticking to the colors that you've got with your airline. And again, it comes down to how much work do you want to do? Do you just want to reach for the fish and have the right fish at the right time? Or do you want to learn to fish on your own? And everybody's different on that. Some people just do not want to spend a lot of time learning to do this stuff. And I understand. I have limited time myself these days. That's why I want to do this video, to kind of give you guys the idea of what's out there. We're almost to the end. Oh yes. Okay, so we're down to the weirdos. We're down to solvents. Solvent lines. All right, yes, they exist. People still paint miniatures with oil paints. This is Scale 75, same company that did the Scale Color Artist, did the Scale Color Flow line. These are their oil paints. They are actual oils. The nice thing about these, though, is that unlike Winsor Newton, if you buy a traditional canvas oil, these are very fluid. So they're much more liquidy. They have a body to them. I'm trying to get it to come out a little bit, but they're quite a bit more smooth, I think, than a traditional tube paint. The reason is that Scale 75 understands that you're probably going to try to use these on minis. And so they wanted a consistency that was going to lend itself to miniature painting, which is, not looking to leave huge dabs of paint on a canvas. So I like these. I did use these. I even went back to oil painting briefly to see if I was missing anything. I don't know where my miniature is that I was working on, but I came to the same conclusion, which is that I just don't like solvents. It was fun, and it's fun to blend, to have all that time to blend. But it is solvent-based, so you're going to have to clean your brushes and thin your paints with, an odorless solvent. This is Scale 75's particular one. And it also has a gloss to it. So after my painting dried, I found that I did want to use this Winsor & Newton matte varnish. If you wait till your paint is dry and your job is finished, then you can put layers of this over it, and it does dull down that glossy finish on your model. The last solvent thing I want to talk about is AK. AK is a line that they're known for their solvents. They also put out acrylic paints, and I think even an Airbrush line, but they're known for their solvent products. And so, like, when you're using with those, you need turpentine, odorless mineral spirits or thinner to clean your brushes. You won't be able to clean up with just soap and water, stuff like that. But if you are willing to go into solvents, there are some cool special effects stuff that you can accomplish with them. And so don't dismiss them out of hand, but ask yourself, is this for me or isn't it? I just want to make you guys aware that there is such a thing, other than the tester's enamels that some of us tried to actually paint minis with when we were kids, right? But okay, that concludes the overview of various types of paint lines. So we have the multitasker that's going to hand you every fish you ever needed at the cost of your wallet. We have the coverage lines that if you are painting for gaming and you're not worried about a lot of other stuff, like they may be perfect for you. We have the versatility line, which is Master Series, which will essentially do anything you can train it to do. If you want a paint that's not going to fight you when you need to thin it, but still going to cover decently and that can perform well in a lot of different techniques, then check out Reaper Master Series. We have the Artist Fluid Acrylics, which are usually a lot like tube paints as far as the colors go, but they're much more fluid and much more happy on miniatures. We have the Artist Tube Paints, including the Miniatures Tube Paints. We have the oil color tubes, and we have solvent-based lines. And I wanted to point out that except for the oils and the solvent-based lines, all of these suckers can be mixed together, and I regularly do. So I don't think there's any line on the planet now that really can't be. It used to be that some of the golden products might react a little bit with others, and that's usually it's because of pH. But nowadays, I found no conflicts. I regularly mix Chimera and Scale Color and Pro Acryl into my Reaper. And I also mix the Model Air into my other metallics on occasion. So really, don't worry, if you have a bunch of paint, mixing it with each other is usually not a problem as long as it's water-based. And the last thing I wanted to say is, almost everybody I know buys a bunch of different paint lines. Don't feel like you have to make a choice and stick to it, obviously. You should maybe, for your first paint line, focus on one that sounds like it might be the right paint line for you. But another way to do it is to honestly choose, say, a couple colors from every paint line. Say there are 3 or 4 that you decide you might want to try. Order a blue and a red, or a black and a white, or a red and a white, or whatever, from each of those paint lines, and play with them. See, paint part of a model you don't care about, and see how they work, how they feel to you. What do you like about them? What don't you like? Doing just a few test colors from a line that you're interested in, and then making a decision is a really good way to go about it. And if you choose colors from that line that you normally use a lot of, favorite colors of yours, or just white and black, then you know that, I'm going to use this anyway. It's not going to go to waste. All right, I'm going to call it there. Thanks so much for tuning in, everybody. This went a little long, but I wanted to kind of cover as many things as I could. There is a PDF for this, a companion PDF, on my Patreon at the $2 tier. That's patreon.com/paintingbig. So if you sign up for the $2 tier, then you can get access to that. There's even more information in there. I know that sounds impossible, but there is. So if you're interested, go on over there, sign up. You also get access to all of the PDFs that I've done for past miniature painting fundamentals videos. So yeah, there you go. All right, thanks so much. And I hope that you learned something from the video and that you enjoyed yourself. And we'll be back at you later this month. Probably I'm going to be doing a short and probably one of the new fundamentals in practice videos. All right? Thanks so much, and this is Anne signing off.